I want to talk for a minute about who the presenters are, briefly, and then who's in the room. So I'm LaDawn Stoddard. I'm the director of the Utah Commission on Service and Volunteerism. And I have Doug Godesky with Corporation for National and Community Service.
Right.
And Renee Cox, who is the director of the Idaho Commission, Serve Idaho. So let's talk for a minute about who we've got. How many AmeriCorps state programs do we have in the room? Do we have any national programs in the room? And I'm assuming we probably don't have any senior corps since this was billed as an AmeriCorps program training. So questions. As we go through this, we want you guys to ask questions as we go. Or again, we'll try to say we have 3 different sections we're covering, and we have a lot of information to cover. It's probably topics that basically 3 of us are taking topics that we could do whole sessions on. So we're going to go really fast, but feel free to ask us questions if we don't cover what you want to see covered specifically, or if we're not answering specific questions. And then at the end of each section, we'll also open it up for a few questions here and there. So feel free to come on in and have a seat. We were trying to stay this way as much as possible, but if we need to move over into that area, go right ahead. So, okay, let's dive in. One thing, there's a disclaimer at the beginning of this, and that is that we're touching on federal regulations. For those of you that are state programs and are working with commissions, your commissions may have some additional requirements. We're not touching on those. So if anything seems a little confusing, you can ask us, but more than likely it probably has to do with some additional requirements your commission may be putting out there, and so those questions would need to go to your commission. So that's the disclaimer. Let's talk about session objectives. This comes straight from your conference guide. We are reviewing basic concepts and responsibilities of managing grants, including, and this isn't all inclusive, but it's specific, CNCS regulations and award provisions, written policies and procedures, member management, document management and retention, reporting requirements, and monitoring for unallowable activities. I believe, has the test gone out at all? No. Do we have somebody who's gonna, you guys are getting pre and post tested. So I need you, we're gonna give you just a couple of minutes to do a pre-test for this session before we dive in. And then as soon as we're gonna make, there's not a lot of questions on it. As soon as, we're gonna give you about 5 minutes to complete this, and then we're just gonna dive into content. So we'll go ahead with the pre-test right now. Thanks.
But it's okay to get wrong answers because we want to see great improvement.
Okay, guys, let's pass all the papers around to one person. We'll have Debbie, raise your hand, Debbie. Debbie will come around and collect them from everybody. It was an easy test, right? Not a big deal. We're going to start off with, let me get my little clicker. We're going to start off with Doug Gadesky. He's going to be talking to you about policy circulars and guiding documents. So here's Doug.
Thank you. And I'm holding two things in my hand. Watch out. One is going to go flying by the time I'm done, I'm sure. I don't have a whole lot of slides to go through with you. And I thought a lot of the deep content and the details my co-presenters are going to go over. I tweaked these slides a little bit to give you a point that I think what this is all about is knowledge management. It's a new world. I have a slide here to talk about the old days that I grew up in and where we are today. I actually have someone on my staff who we've tagged as our knowledge manager now because it's become so important. People expect to find things in an instant. They want the policies, they want the records and everything. It's just a different world. Whereas my first federal job, you could answer the phone and have the secretary on the IBM Selectric type a letter, and a week later you can mail it, and 2 weeks later you can find the information they wanted, and it was no big deal. But that's a different world today. So that's what I kind of wanted to say is that those days are gone. Then we had email come along, and we had the internet come along. But today, those are the expectations people have for us, is that when you're being audited, when your state commission shows up, when we call you up on the phone, there's no time lag anymore. People want it yesterday. And that's why this egg here, this has been, if you ever have gone to corporation training, you've probably seen this diagram. This is a diagram showing you all the streams of information that come at you and the hierarchy that they're under. Like the notice of funding opportunities, sometimes they're called NOFOs, no fuzz. We put them out. There's going to be a conference call tomorrow, I believe, on the NOFA for AmeriCorps 2014. So that lays out a bunch of rules, expectations. They change every year. They get tweaked. And then you have your own proposal and budget. That's driven by your own organization's policies. You get a notice of grant award. Well, that notice of grant award, if you're a direct recipient from the federal government, it looks one way, and it lays out special conditions. And you need to know what those special conditions, that's all knowledge management. What is this grant required to do that's special this time that it didn't have to do last time? State government, they'll attach, the next thing up is the grant provisions, certifications, and assurances. Well, a state government, if they're passing the money through to you, they're going to attach their terms and conditions to that award. So that's a whole nother assembly of requirements and standards and knowledge management you have to have. So the only thing I can offer to say about this is you can show your boss this diagram and say, look how much I have to know about and how much I'm worth to you when it comes to be performance assessment and pay raise time. So just want to pluck one of the examples out, federal regulations. We always like to make sure everyone's aware that there are federal circulars. That's where government-wide federal rules begin, and the federal government's pushing all this grant money out to all the states, nonprofits, and universities, and all these rules flow through to the recipients of the money. Well, it's divided into a grid today. For years, probably 30 years, it's been on this grid. You've got universities getting one set of primarily 3 sets of rules, nonprofits getting their 3 sets of rules, state and local governments getting their 3 sets of rules. So you have to use this matrix to say, okay, I'm a nonprofit. Whenever someone passes money to me, these federal regulations, they used to be called OMB circulars. If you go online to whitehouse.gov, I think we've got the link at the bottom there. Really, the thing you need to know about this is go to whitehouse.gov/OMB/grants, or just Google it for OMB circulars. It'll be one of the first hits. You can pretty much you'll immediately find a list of all these circulars, and they're not difficult reading, but if you're involved in grants management today and you have not taken the time to read these, you're really doing yourself a disservice, because eventually it'll catch up to you. Eventually someone will have an expectation that you didn't know about and you didn't. So there's so many rules here that you have to set your priorities on how you're going to manage your information. Oh, and yes.
I've heard rumors the OMBA 133 circular for nonprofits is going to be amended to increase that audit requirement to $1 million. Do you know if that's true?
Perfect timing, perfect question. Well, today, the rule on what we call an A133 audit is $500,000 of spending in your fiscal year. So if you as an organization receive $500,000 or more and spend it, or you may receive $10 million and spend $501,000 of it, you come under the A133 audit rules for that year. This question is it going to go up? There's a thing called what the government wants to call it is the one circular. The current administration looked at this grid of rules, and it's even actually a longer grid if you lay them all out, and said let's try to put it all in one place. So for the last 3 years, there's been an effort where they've been asking for public comment. There's been 3 waves of public comment to this one big thing we call, they want us to call it right now the one circular. Previously, people were calling it the super circular, the omnibus circular. Now the term that it's probably going to go out as the one circular. The one circular is taking all this information and putting it in one place. And that alone is a noble goal, and that's a simplification. It doesn't mean that the rules for a university will change absolutely, but it does mean that if you're going down the cost principles and say, okay, these costs are allowable and unallowable, oh, but for universities, here's an exception or a change or something like that. The one change they expect in the last wave of public comment was to raise the threshold from 500,000 to 750,000, not $1 million. 750 is, and you can't bet on it, but you can, count on it without risking any money. It's going to go 750. Until it's published, you never know.
Do you know what the estimated date for publication is?
The goals today are for OMB to publish the final rules, because they've got it postured as a final rule right now. They hope before the shutdown to publish in November. So they're reassessing their schedule. So I suspect they're going to come up with January at the latest. That's their goal. And then federal agencies will have 1 year after it's published to write implementing regulations. So even if OMB says, okay, here's all the new rules, my federal agency will have 1 year to absorb those into our rules. Now, for example, the 750 threshold, that'll be really important to us. Relieves a lot of people a lot of cost and time and worry. We might, and we could, our lawyers will be our only hurdle, publish a very quick rule, single rule. Hey, we have a year to work out all these other changes, but this one change is so important to us. Here's a single rule that we're adopting today. We did that with the criminal history checks. If anyone remembers back in 2009, the criminal history check rules came around. They got changed where more programs were under the rules, and murder was now an offense that you couldn't bring someone into service who had that on the record. So that was so important, we put out a quick rule. Murder no longer allowed. But I didn't say that exactly right, but you know the point. Okay. It's as if we had been letting, recruiting murderers previously. Yeah. So there are a lot of changes, and I've been in several conferences with other federal agencies about all these changes, and you see a lot of blank faces like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do that? Oh my gosh, how am I going to do that? But the good news for my agency is, right or wrong, we've been doing a lot of it already. And a lot of that is driven by our Inspector General's oversight on us, saying, you've got to really keep your eye on these programs. And Congress saying, keep an eye on this, report on this, assess risk, give them more information, all that stuff. So this new one circular says, all federal agencies, you got to publish all this information in your NOFAs. Well, we've been doing 90% of it already. Federal agencies, you've got to assess risk before you do an award. Well, we've been doing that already. Federal agencies, when you don't audit someone, you have to have a monitoring plan. We've been doing that already. So for my agency, the change is not that great. For other agencies, it's shocking to them. And they're going to have a lot of trouble absorbing that into their way of doing business. Okay? So I thought, okay, to kind of get close to closing up, I know we have a lot more detailed stuff. I thought about if I was going to tackle a knowledge management portfolio for my grant program, I would want to look at my records, my policies and procedures. P&P, I mean policies and procedures, KM, knowledge management. I would want administrative policies and procedures on how I do my reports, how I do my evaluations, how I close out my grants, where my records go, what records do I keep, my time and attendance, my ethics policies, my equal rights, my equipment inventory. That comes from just my experience when I go on an oversight visit, the types of things we're looking for and I find most important to have, and the voids that you just don't want to have those kind of voids. The list could be 100 things depending upon the size of your organization and how many things you do. The key is these policies and procedures have to be of the quality level that you could step away and someone else could do your job. That's the level of detail that's the ideal. Financial, you certainly want to talk about the allowable and unallowable costs that your program wants to pay most close attention to, the authorities and delegations of authority. Always important to, if I'm gone, who has the authority to act behind me? You don't see that policy in place in too many organizations, but when an auditor comes and they say, well, who approved this and who had the position to do X, Y, and Z, having a delegations of authority that's more than, well, when I'm gone, a verbal explanation, when I'm gone, having it in writing, who follows behind me, will not just solve a lot of confusion, it gives you respect from the auditors. When they walk in and they see an organization that has knowledge management policy and procedures, they very quickly view you as highly performing, and their radar goes down, and they're already respecting you a lot more. Travel and procurement, absolutely gaps that I see very often is not having a travel policy. When you go, who approves the trip, who checks the budget to make sure you had money for it, who approves the voucher, and so forth. Procurement policies. A lot of these things, if you work for a state government or local government, these are all in place at a higher level. They're taken care of for you. But if you're at the nonprofit level, the operations level, on the street, you've got to write them yourselves. It's also not that difficult to search the internet for examples and adapt them to your needs. Criminal history checks, I would set that as a standalone policy and procedure. It can be embedded in your human resources policies, but it's such an important thing. There's so many financial consequences to not getting criminal history checks right. I would absolutely, if I did one thing, if I didn't have any of these, if I did one of them, I would make sure I had that one on file. Program management, your member and volunteer management policies, authorities, delegations, communication channels. We were just brainstorming before the session about communication channels, how important it is to know who to contact at the state level when you have a problem. And I have a little nifty diagram. There's kind of a sweet spot here that you've got the CNCS, Corporation for National Services, one of the drivers of all the communication. You've got the prime grantee, which is your commission, your national direct, and then you've got your organization. If you're involved in this three-way triangle of communications, that sweet spot, first on your policies and procedures is where they all intersect. Because if you have a policy and procedure, you have to consider what all three have asked of you. And then communications, you need to know who's the program officer in charge of those communications. And LaDawn will speak more to this, but each of these organizations sets up its own different approach to communications. Like in my federal agencies that I've worked for, Health and Human Services and the corporation and HUD, we always would have a grants officer and a program officer with different duties. When I worked for the Department of Interior, as a grants officer, I was also a program expert. So I had my environmental science expertise, and I gave answers and direction on grants that way. And I also had the financial learning, that I've absorbed that I would give so I'd give the whole answer. I didn't have to reach out. So that's going to differ, and you need to know who your contacts are. All right, with that, I think I got a slide or two. There are a lot of sources. These slides will be posted on the conference materials. There's a lot of sources that you can say are strong and some are weak. Your grant proposal budget, your grant cover letter, terms and conditions, the Code of Federal Regulations, those circulars, FAQs, policy memos, and actually grant and program officer emails. Those are all strong policy and procedure and communications and records. You get into weak records, unadvisable reliability is when you get into, we have a knowledge network. A lot of that is best practices stuff, and a lot of that can become outdated. Be cautious when you use those things. We've had communities. We have these things of blogs and people sharing information. We've had listservs. We have simply networking at these conferences. All good ways to learn, but be cautious because there is a lot of misinformation. Every conference you go to, there is someone there that doesn't exactly, or they're telling you something that's right for their program, but not correct for yours. These are just the basics, a couple slides we had that obviously cost principle circulars talk about costs. Obviously administrative circulars talk about administrative requirements. And I know I'm up on time, so I'm just going to ask for a brief discussion on anything, just the foundation that you've got a lot of rules coming at you, got a lot of places you have to go for information, and if you do one thing when you go back is say, if we don't have a knowledge management strategy, you should develop one. Any discussion before we move on? Okay, thank you.
Passing the baton. Okay, so I'm up next, and we're going to talk about member management requirements. This is the bigger section of what we're going through. And I wanted to do this by having you as program people think about recruitment. So how you start off getting a member in the door and getting them up and running through to exit. Okay? So I want to know, what is the very first thing? You've got a really excited member now. They're at your office. They're ready to go. What's one of the first things you're going to do to verify that this member is eligible to work? I just gave you two kind of hints. So tell me, what are you going to do? What? I'm sorry, what? The I-9, okay. So, which includes what? There's two requirements that the corporation has that you have to verify, that they're eligible to serve. Not background check. What's citizenship? And I heard it over here. Age. Very first. You don't want to run any background checks on them if they're under 17, right? And you need to make sure, now you're no longer required to get the documentation for the citizenship, but you're asking them, are you a U.S. citizen, permanent resident, alien, or national, right? To verify that they're going to be able to work in your program. Okay? So let's talk for just a minute, because this is stuff you guys know. shouldn't be anything new to you. They have to be a lawful citizen, national, or permanent resident alien of the United States. They have to be at least 17 years old. Out of school youth at age 16 can participate in Youth Corps. Kind of a little bit of different program. Anybody that works with Youth Corps in this room at all? Okay, so then basically for you guys, they have to be 17 or older. They need a high school diploma or its equivalent, or they need to certify that they're going to be willing to get that before they use the education award. Okay, so they can't drop out of school to join AmeriCorps. Sounds really exciting, but they can't leave high school to join AmeriCorps. Okay, and tutors, if you're a tutoring program, your tutors have to have a high school diploma or GED, right? Those have to be in place. Okay, any questions about that one? So let's talk for just a minute. I mentioned CNCS doesn't require you to verify citizenship any longer, right? You don't have to see the documents itself. You don't actually have to keep copies. It's not a requirement anymore by the corporation for you to keep copies. Now, I'm not saying that your commission doesn't have this requirement, but the corporation does not require you to keep copies of documents, even for age verification, as long as you have a policy in place that you're reviewing them and certifying. So let's talk about what that means. It means that you have something that says that you identified the original, that identifies the original document reviewed, that it identifies the eligibility or criteria that the document is meeting, so it would say their age, right? You're doing this for age. It is, you put the identification number. So if you're seeing a driver's license, the driver's license number should be somewhere, and then you're signing and certifying that you reviewed it. That's all the federal requirements are. Again, your state commission, if you're a state program, may require that you keep copies of these documents. Birth certificates, driver's license, or passports are the examples of the appropriate documentation for age. Okay, so next, as of February 27th, 2012, you no longer have to review citizenship documents. When you put them in e-grants, the Social Security number will be sent to the Social Security Administration for verification. You had a question.
About the diploma, there's no requirement for reviewing a document to verify that.
No, the corporation allows individuals to self-certify that they're a high school graduate, so you don't have to see a document by the federal level. Any other questions? Yes.
So for the age thing, I mean, I record the documents I look at, but now thinking about it, I don't know that I actually have like a box that I check that says yes, they're 17 or older. It's just kind of like implied. So should that be like explicitly spelled out?
You need to indicate somehow from that previous slide that you are identifying what the document you're reviewing is for. So I would say my suggestion would be certification of age of above 17 or something like that, and then, below. Now that's just an example. It could be many different ways. You guys are very familiar with the fact that the corporation doesn't dictate specifics, so each program could have a different way to do that. But it just has to meet those criteria. So I would say that yes, somehow, some way it needs to say that you're reviewing it to certify age. Okay, so we covered this one. Now you're just putting the Social Security number in e-grants, and it's being sent to the Social Security Administration for review. Okay, in the past, let's go back in the past, up until August of this year, if there was a problem, you would get an email saying, get this documentation and fax it in, right? How many of you had to deal with that? Yes. Okay. So as of August, that is no longer the case. You're going to get an email saying, there is a problem. You need to scan the documents, keep them on file for reference. So that would be the only situation where, let's see, I just want to make sure. Need to obtain and review copies. So, obtain. So you're going to need to have the copies on file if you get the notification from the Social Security Administration saying there's an issue. Yes?
They're eligible now, but the visa or whatever they're on, it would be a visa for getting the document, but it expires during term. Do you then need to follow up and get the document that they've renewed, get that on file too?
Are you a state program? talk with your commission, have them talk with their program people at the corporation and verify what the corporation feels like would be the requirement. Doug, any suggestions on that? If the documents are valid when you review them, but they're going to expire during the term of service.
I can answer in context of how we handled it for the criminal history checks, because we had a question: if someone becomes 18 during their term of service, then you have to anticipate that and behave by doing a check on the front end on that person, even though they're 17 at that moment in time. I would suspect a similar logic was applied to this question. Was, if someone today is okay, but tomorrow they won't be, they'll have an expired, it'll change. I think you have to anticipate that and consider it invalid, but we can get you official answer.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying that they wouldn't be allowed to serve because.
So I've asked that question, corporation, and it was that we had to determine that the documentation was updated.
So you had to know the expiration date and bring the, okay.
But a new document would come along in place and be added to it.
At the time and throughout that first period, but if in the middle of your term of service, if that document expires, as long as you get verification from the individual that demonstrates that they got a reissue of a new documentation for eligibility, then you can use that to continue their service.
But expiration with no documentation of renewal means that their service ends. Is that what you're, that would be?
Well, they would have 90 days to apply for the new documentation, so it depends on what time of the program year that you look at the documentation. So, I mean, if it's current at the time of eligibility and the time that you're enrolling them, we were told that's fine. You just have to look at, so like we had a person in September start, by March they're expiring. We just have to know and ensure that they're registering in December to be able to reissue for a new green card, or, you know.
Let me see if I can get an answer by the end.
Yeah, we'll get some specific clarification on that because there would be the possibility of potentially, if it doesn't get renewed, then what the situation, then what the situation would be. So we'll make sure we get you some clarification. Sir, if you would like to just touch base with Doug and so he can get your contact information and get back to you, that would be great. Okay. So, any other questions on this process? Has anybody been involved in this since the new process went into place? Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Just to let you know, the email is still saying
Fax it.
And so we were like, what? I got an email that just said, no, don't fax it. No, I must have been right.
Okay.
Maybe early in the system.
Okay. Yes.
I had somebody that I enrolled prior in August,
Mm-hmm.
and so that email had been saying that, you know, you have to follow up with the fax, and then I have a second member that fell after, so I've
Oh, and so the second member didn't request the fax. It was only if it was before August. Okay. Okay. So any other? Yes. Go ahead.
And the email goes to everyone with an eGrant account, so all the top administrators in the program get these. You have to do this within this time, but don't do it. Messages.
Yeah, we're all very familiar with eGrants, and we love eGrants. Yes, go ahead.
Are there any known glitches with that system at this point? Because we also received some that were last year members, not current programs.
That said, did it say fax something in?
Actually, not, it was a 25-day notice from the
There.
so
There have been some glitches with the system sending out. After you've faxed information in, it continues to resend. I know of that. So I would assume there may be other things. And obviously, with this new policy, you're just going to get the email that says you have to do this, and you may get another email, but you'll know if you've got the documents in the member file. So, yeah. So, okay. Any other questions about this policy? Okay, just briefly, so if you do have to get appropriate documentation, acceptable documentation, this is the same series of documents that used to be there when you had to collect the information. So it's, you know, for U.S. citizen or national, birth certificate, passport, I'm not going to go through it all, but just so you know, this PowerPoint will be available online. So we're not giving any handouts. We're trying to stay as paperless as possible. So that's part of the reason why some of these slides look like they have a lot of information, because we're providing it as your handout type information. So I won't go through everything that's on there. Lawful permanent resident has these particular items that they can use for documentation. Updated verification process. This slide relates to if you find that the reason the Social Security number kicked back is because somebody transposed a number, and so you need to make some changes, actually change information because the wrong information was submitted. There's still a process to do that, and it is through faxing documentation in and because you want the information to be accurate in the trust when the member goes to try to use that education award. So if you get a response back and you realize that it's due to user error as far as putting information in the system incorrectly, this is the process you'll follow to try to make changes to that. Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, would we have to, if a passport expires during the member term of service, would we have to follow up similarly for the visa?
Not with the passport, because you can actually use an expired passport as verification of U.S. citizenship. So, is that for this one? So this is the lawful permanent resident. It was on the other one. Oh, it's here. A valid U.S. passport. It does. You don't have to deal with it. No. So. Okay. So any additional information regarding this change, this new policy, is available at that particular website, and it will answer any additional questions. I know there's some FAQs around it and some different things that are available as a resource for you. So. Now you've got eligibility verified. Sorry, I tend to talk a little loud. Now you've got eligibility verified. What's next? NSOPR and SOPW, right? The very next thing you're going to do. That make sure that it's done. We all know that you cannot, and I'm not going into a lot of the criminal history stuff because there's been a whole session on it, but you know, members can't start service. You can't start a member in service until that's done. Period. End of story. There's no workarounds. And that you've got to have that dated. You got to be able to verify that it was done prior to the member earning any hours. So once you've done all your criminal checks, done everything you're supposed to, let's talk about enrolling a member in e-grants. 30-day enrollment. It's becoming more and more relevant. The corporation is looking more and more heavily at that. It really does. It can affect funding, guys. I mean, I don't think people recognize, but at a commission level, we are constantly justifying, explaining, trying to clarify why their members aren't enrolled within 30 days. And remember, some months have 31, and 31 is outside of 30. So if you bring a member, I mean, if they start on the 15th and you have on your calendar that you can get them in by the 15th of the next month, make sure there's not 31 days in that month, because that'll throw you off. It's important. It's really critical, and I can't repeat it enough. I think some programs, we tended, when the corporation kind of wasn't saying a lot about it, to not really keep it high on our radar. It's important that it stays there. In every application process now, you have to explain why you have issues with enrolling members outside of 30 days. In every application the corporation does. Okay, there's also a policy that you notify the trust within 30 days of any change in the member's term of service. So we're talking, and we're not talking exits yet here, but if for some reason, a member goes from full to part-time, part to full, any adjustments in that term of service, you need to make those changes. Notifying means, actually, when we talk about notifying the trust, that's what e-grants does. So those changes, once those changes are permanent in e-grants, then it sends the information over to the trust. But that needs to be done within 30 days also. So, and then just the little paragraph at the bottom, failure to report such changes within 30 days may result in sanctions to the grantee up to and including suspension or termination of the grant. So they're taking it more and more seriously all the time. So now we've got a member in e-grants. Reasonable accommodations. And I said, we're touching on a lot of things here. Reasonable accommodations. What's a reasonable accommodation? Anybody got a good example for me? Lindsay, tell me what a reasonable accommodation is. An example of a reasonable accommodation.
For our program, we have certain projects for our conservation workers that are accessible to facilities.
Okay. Anybody else? Did I start to see a hand go up here? Yes, reasonable accommodation.
Yeah, wheelchair accessible restroom facilities and ramps to get up to hospital.
Okay. Somebody else, yes.
We had a member who was deaf, so we contracted with our state commission to get interpreters for training.
Okay. I saw another hand over here.
Just if a member has a medical condition that basically affects their cognitive functioning throughout the day, allowing them to have a flexible time schedule.
Okay. Allowing them to have a flexible time schedule. Does it mean that anything an individual with a disability needs, you have to accommodate? Within reason. Okay, there are some very specific guidelines that the corporation puts out. One of the things that I want, and we try to make available to our programs is, sorry, I'm gonna, okay, I'm not going to find it that easily. So it cannot place an undue burden, financial hardship on an organization. So just keep that in mind. You have to do things that are reasonable within the capability of your organization to do, right? But it cannot put, I mean, it's not necessary for you to accommodate the request if it's an undue hardship to the organization. So my interpretation of that, and Doug can correct me if I'm wrong, but that means financial. That also means you should not have to significantly change your program model, your service delivery, to accommodate an individual. Unless, as an organization, you think that's an improvement, you're more than willing to do that, but you don't, it's not something you have to do. Yes?
So these issues are often going to come up before the member's been entered. You're going to find this out possibly in the interview process and so forth. Is there any additional rules or guidance about how to proceed with the interviewing selection of members? That these might be on the table?
Not specifics. There's a document out there that's really old that is called Access AmeriCorps. And it's actually, I'd recommend it to you guys. I don't think that there's anything in it because it follows the ADA guidelines and they haven't changed significantly for quite a while. But what it is it's an assessment of your organization as to are you accommodating and accessible. So it goes through interviewing procedures. It's a self-evaluation, self-assessment. And it has some really good suggestions in it about how to handle some of that kind of stuff. Yes?
There's also the website, the NSIP website. If you're not familiar with that, that's a really good resource for inclusion guidelines.
Yeah, NSIP, National Service Inclusion Project. They were a contractor for the corporation for several years around disability inclusion, and they have a lot of resources on their website also related to reasonable accommodations. Any other questions about this? One of the things that you cannot discriminate against a person with a disability in a hiring process if it's possible for you to accommodate them within your program. Does that make sense? One of the things that I suggest, and it has not necessarily has to do with people with disabilities, but as you put out a position description in recruitment, you be very specific about what the requirements are for your program, for an individual to serve within your program. I work for the state of Utah, and they have a section that's called physical requirements for every job they post, and it talks about, you know, is it going to be sedentary? Is there going to be heavy lifting? You know, so people can self-select if you put that information in your position description or your recruitment posting. Then they can determine whether or not they feel like they're able to meet what you've posted. And that's how I would suggest you handle if you feel like there might be a situation where a certain type of physical limitation may not work within your program model. But I think sometimes you have to think outside of the box, and sometimes we have some preconceived notions, and if you interview that person, they may have some suggestions on how they may be able to do the job that you hadn't thought of. Yes?
So I have a question about that. What if you have like you have a job where we go out and do street outreach. So you're walking along the river and carrying materials and we have a person who is disabled who feels like they can do that.
Okay. Have them tell you how.
So can we actually have them demonstrate?
No, I don't think you can ask them to demonstrate, but person in a wheelchair may be able to get up and down that river. You may think they wouldn't be able to, but they may be able to. There may be, rather than them carrying something, there may be an attachment that could pull something with, you know what I mean? There's a lot of ways to look at things, and sometimes they're programmed more to look at those possibilities than you may be.
So then what happens if they do try and then they can't? Can we put them into a different program or?
I'm not going to answer all of these questions. I can't tell you how to decide on whether or not someone could fill the position. I think that you would have to, as an organization, you probably want to talk to your HR department if you have one. If not, you would, find the appropriate resources to determine how to handle that. I'm not an expert and I can't answer those types of things. So, okay, any other questions about reasonable accommodations? Okay, member agreements. This is directly from the provisions. And I'm not going to go over all of it because I think most of us are very familiar with what needs to be in a member agreement. But just know that I think if you look at the test that you took, some of these things are probably things that the test asked you about. There are some changes in the 2013 program year to what has to be in a member agreement. They're very specific in, if you look at the ones that are in bold, the text of 45 CFR 2540.100 E and F, which relates to non-duplication and non-displacement. The text of that needs to be in your member contract. Text of 45 CFR 2520.40 through 45, which relates to fundraising by members. The verbiage or text from that regulation needs to be in your member contract. Now, I know we're guilty. We did not realize that this change had happened and we had programs issuing member contracts. So what we did is an addendum. We talked with our programs and did an addendum which has that particular text and put it out there for the member to sign and put it with the member contract. So non-displacement, and yeah, go ahead before I get into that.
Position description, can you have that as an addendum to the member?
You can say you can have a position, when it says the position description, you can say see attached or something like that so that you have, position descriptions are kind of a big deal. I don't know how many of you are aware at a federal level they're doing random auditing quarterly of position descriptions. How many of you have had to provide a position description? Okay. At a commission level, if you have really great position descriptions ready and available, it really helps us because we get a lot of requests every quarter for a whole bunch of different programs. It needs to be really clear. It needs to clarify exactly what those member activities are, and those member activities need to be able to tie back to the scope of work you outlined in the application. I mean, that's critical. If you have a bunch of activities that don't relate at all to what you put in your application, that's going to be an audit finding. And there's a potential that they could disallow hours related to those activities because the correlation isn't there. Am I wrong, Doug? Okay. So you need to understand there's an area in your application where you discuss member activities. Those member activities that you've put in your application should go right into a position description in some way. Any questions on that? I mean, we recognize things that kind of crop up that start becoming hot buttons with the corporation, and that's one of them. Mainly, the audit of position descriptions is mainly looking for prohibited activities and making sure that there's nothing showing up that would be prohibited. But it's important as organizations that our members are clear on what their expectations are, and that's what you're putting in a contract for a member to sign. So that position description should clearly define what the member activities are doing. Minimum number of service hours. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate, minimum number of service hours. How many of you have ever had that member that says, man, I hit 1,700, I am done? No, their term of service is not just hours. Their term of service is everything as an organization you have asked them to do should be clearly defined in that contract, and you need to train your members that it's minimum hours. If they end up at 1,750, they end up at 1,750. They've committed to a particular time frame and a particular term of service that they're going to complete with your organization. Okay, amount of education awards. Some of these things are newer. I mean, they haven't always been there. I've been around with my agency for almost 10 years, and many of these things weren't there before. So minimum number, or the amount of the education award being offered. Code of conduct, prohibited activities, non-duplication and displacement, fundraising, drug-free workplace. The other one that is highlighted is civil right requirements, complaint procedures, and right of beneficiaries. Civil right requirements and compliant procedures have always sort of been there. They're the equal opportunity type of language that I think most of us have in our contracts. Right of beneficiaries is new, and I can't tell you a lot about it. Did we get an answer at all?
The answer I received is a claim that it's not new.
Oh.
But I do have the people working on sorting that out.
Well, you can go back to the 2012 provisions, and it's not there. So. So right of beneficiaries. So basically, if you look at the provisions, there is a section that talks about if a member, it becomes deceased during their term of service, you have to notify the corporation. And I think this has happened in a few cases over the last little while, and some things have cropped up related to what are the rights of beneficiaries. Can they access the education award? Can they access living allowance? Da-da-da-da-da. We don't have answers for you guys on what it might look like in a member contract to discuss right of beneficiaries. We're working on it. I just want to let you know we're working on that and trying to get you that information. So hopefully if you watch FAQs, that we're hoping, Doug sent a request yesterday to the corporation asking them for clarification, and we're hoping that we get additional information for you on that one. Okay. Suspension and termination rules, release for cause, grievance procedures, and other requirements established by the grantee. So that last one means you guys can add the additional things you want to see happen within a term of service. And then the member is held to that. Just because they complete 1,700 hours, if they didn't do all these other things, they didn't completely execute and complete a term of service. Hours are not all there is. No, you can say in the contract, see grievance procedures, member handbook, page such and such. And then you can have them. But then we're going to talk about orientation in just a minute. You need to be going over them. You can't just hand them 10 pages of grievance procedure and assume that they're going to know what it says. Does that make sense? Okay, any other questions about this? Prohibited activities. And I'm going really fast, I know, and I'm covering a lot of information. We're all aware of prohibited activities. I'm not going to go over all of these again, but these are what they are. What I am going to touch on is on this next slide that's underlined. AmeriCorps members may not engage in any of the above activities directly or indirectly by recruiting volunteers, by recruiting, training, or managing others for the primary purpose of engaging in one of the activities listed above. So basically, they can't recruit volunteers to do those activities as an AmeriCorps member within the program. So, and that's language that's new as of the last couple of years. You want to make sure if you have a member contract that you've been using for several years that it's been updated to include all this new language. Any questions about that? Okay, this is the language from 45 CFR, non-displacement and non-duplication and non-displacement. So this is this specific language that needs to be in the contract. The members can't displace, right? And this is the language from 45 CFR 2520 from relating to fundraising. There is, I think we're going to get into fundraising in a minute. So, member on board. Review and sign a member service agreement prior to accumulating hours. Prior to accruing, or prior to accumulating service hours, correct. This is, I don't know, in our state, this can be a little difficult. Let's say you have, you don't have members sign contracts until you're doing the orientation. You do the orientation a week into service because they've spent 2 or 3 days at their site and now they're at their orientation signing contracts. Technically, they're earning hours before they've signed it, right?
Can they earn hours while they're?
They can earn hours on the same day, right? So if Monday's start of orientation, their contract's dated Monday, they can count the hours. But they can't have served 2 days at their site and then come to orientation on Monday and count those 2 days. Any questions about that one? Okay. Conduct an orientation for members, including training on the following. Members' rights and responsibilities, specific skills and knowledge to perform service, prohibited activities, program code of conduct, drug-free workplace, suspension and termination, grievance procedures, specific safety precautions. So these are the basics. That doesn't mean that's all that needs to be in your orientation, but these are the basics, right? These are the things you need to make sure they're aware of.
So where would this list appear in the resources?
In what resources? Your provisions list what needs to be covered. Yeah, the provisions, there's a couple of things that we've added. The provisions don't necessarily list specific skills and knowledge to perform service or specific safety precautions, but they list everything else on that list.
So we just had to give this training to know those two?
Well, no, obviously as a program, if they're going to tutor, you're going to train them on how to tutor. That's a specific skill, right? So you're going to go over that in orientation. I'm just saying those two are things that are common sense type things that you really can't just throw a member out there with training them on what they're going to be doing as a member. Does that make sense?
So basically our orientation agenda should probably explicitly list out all of those bullet points.
It probably should. And as a commission, we do something that I don't know if every commission does, but we have a pre-contract package and we require seeing a program's orientation agenda, and I'm looking for all those things. So every one of those items in some way needs to be incorporated in what their agenda for their orientation is. Debbie.
I just wanted to clarify on the first bullet. We've had questions come up that people read the word service hours literally, and it can't be they go to training for a week and then start their service. That it needs to be on the first day they accumulate any hours, whether service or training, that count towards their educational hours.
Correct. So it's not just it's not direct service hours. It's any of the hours the member's accumulating. Correct. So it's service, training, fundraising, any of that. Okay? Yes.
Our orientation, our safety training takes 2 days.
Okay.
Skills training takes 3 more ongoing. So we don't have to do that all. I mean, we can spread that over the first month. It doesn't all have to be crunched in.
Okay. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. However, your program decides you need to do orientation, that's fine. The biggest thing that you need to be aware of is the rationale behind the member service agreement being signed before the member starts is that you've got everything in that member contract that outlines what the expectations for the member are. It's really unfair to the member to have them start their term of service and not know completely what those expectations are, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to start your job without having some sort of an agreement that gives you information on what that job is, right? So it needs to be looked at that way. Orientation doesn't have to happen at a specific time. Certain pieces of orientation probably need to happen pretty early on. Member rights and responsibilities, prohibited activities. You shouldn't let a member start service without knowing what the prohibited activities are, right? Program code of conduct, drug-free, grievance, suspension and term. I mean, there's some common sense things here, obviously, that you wouldn't want a member to be 3 months into their service before you've covered these topics with them. Okay? Anything else? Okay, provide members with adequate supervision by qualified supervisors consistent with the approved application. The application's asking you how you're going to supervise members. You should be supervising them the way you explained in that application, right? Members shouldn't be at a site without some sort of supervision, some sort of a go-to person that they can go to if they need some help, they need some additional information. Term of service, let's talk about that. So you've developed member position descriptions that are meaningful for service activities. They completely describe everything the member's going to be doing, or specifics related to what the member's going to be doing. You make sure that the member has sufficient opportunity to complete their required number of hours. Obviously, for a full-time member, they've now said that it's possible for them to do it. I think they've taken it to 9 months, right? You have to give them at least 9 months. It used to be 10, but I think they took it to 9.
I was having a sidebar conversation with keeping an eye on time.
No. Okay, I'm moving. For full-time members, you cannot require them to do full-time 1,700 hours in less than 9 months, right? Okay.
Full-time is a 9-month definition, and they earn the award. In fact, I even had this on an auditing question, is you need, as LaDawn was saying, you need to get them to serve their entire time period. However, there's no, if you release them early, you need to have the conditions for releasing them early outlined in that agreement.
So the main thing to be aware of is you can the shortest amount of time you can contract for a full-time member with is 9 months. So you can contract with them to complete in 9 months. If you've contracted for them to complete in 10 months and they complete in 9, my opinion is they serve 10 months. I mean, they've hit 1,700 hours in 9. They should serve 10 months. They contracted for 10 months. It's up to you as an organization, but you're probably going to leave that site kind of hanging if that member leaves a month early. We'll get into a little bit more detail, okay? So one of the other things that I need to make sure that you're aware is how many of you are an organization that is that places members at sites outside of your organization? Okay. It's up to you guys to monitor those sites, right? So there should be training for those site supervisors on prohibited activities so they're completely aware of what the members can and can't do. And then you as an organization should periodically be checking in to make sure that that site's not doing anything, having that member do anything that isn't within their scope of work, because a prohibited activity is also anything that's outside of what the scope of work the member's supposed to be doing is, right? Because that can become unallowable, and then those costs related to that can become questioned if it's not within the member's scope of work. So, monitoring. You should have monitoring procedures that include prevention of prohibited activities, detection of prohibited activities, and corrective action. And a lot of times programs don't understand don't really think of themselves in the corrective action role. At a commission level, we kind of have that, we've had that really pounded into our brains that we're there to help process corrective action. But at a program level, you're there for that reason too. If you have sites, you're there to make sure that those sites are doing what they're supposed to. So if you find something that's not happening like it's supposed to, you need to implement some sort of a corrective action to get it in compliance. Okay, member timesheets. Member timesheets are a record of service and training hours, and they are documentation necessary to support eligibility for the member to receive the education award. They should distinguish between hours spent in direct service, training, and fundraising. So, 20%, we're all aware, right? No more than 20% member development or training, and 10% fundraising if you allow a member to fundraise. A lot of programs just don't allow that, and so it doesn't happen. But if you have a member fundraising, there's a 10% cap on that, and a 20% cap on member development. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole details of is that per member, is that per your total group. If you have questions about that, I suggest you go to your commission, or if you're a national director, go to your program officer. But those are the caps enforced, are the 20 and the 10. Timesheets should be totaled, marked in permanent ink, not pencil, and signed by the member and the supervisor. 2 signatures. The supervisor that's signing should be the supervisor that can attest that the members actually did those hours. Right? You're not going to have somebody at your office being that second signature when you don't know if that member showed up on that site on a regular basis or not. Okay. Electronic timesheets are allowed when a grantee identifies an authentic. Did that lose a whole bunch of the stuff on it? Okay, hang on. Because it had a whole bunch of. Let me come out. Nope, it's not there either. Okay, 1 second. Okay. I'm just going to read it off, and then we're going to make sure that the. Okay. Electronics timesheets. You have an established written policy establishing the use of an electronic timekeeping system. You have a secure, verifiable electronic signature that identifies and authenticates a particular person as the source and indicates such person's approval of the form. So how many of you use electronic timesheets? So you need to have a distinct username and password for each user, right? It also needs to be something that once a supervisor signs it, it can't be changed. So those are the federal requirements. I mean, if a member signs it, it can be changed 100 times, until they submit it for approval by the supervisor. Once the supervisor signs it, no changes to that timesheet. Whatever source you're using needs to be able to keep it secure. I highly recommend electronic timesheets. They make life really, really easy, getting rid of paper. Oh, that's why it's all there. That's what happens when you put animation in and you forget. Okay, so you need to have a written policy around electronic timesheets, and then you have to have the signatures that we talked about, and the last bullet is no changes. Member living allowance disbursement. I'm going to hit this really, really fast. Did I see a hand? Yes. Yeah, so the system needs to kind of have a log that tracks any changes after that supervisor, but it can do that. Okay. Living allowance disbursement. The main thing you guys need to know, everybody knows this. It's not a wage, it's not hourly. It's paid in regular increments. It is made during the member's term of service. If you exit them early, they're not getting any additional living allowance. And it needs to cease when they conclude terms of service. It cannot be in a lump sum. So if you decide that a member, leaves early and you want to pay him the last 3 months, can't do it. You need to be paying that member the exact same amount as any other member doing the exact same work. So even if the contract's shorter for this member because they're only going to do it in 10 months instead of 12 months, you don't get to change the living allowance for 10 months. Unless there's a significant difference in the work you're having that person do versus what everybody else that's doing 12 months is doing. You can't change the monthly. So technically the idea is if they do it in 10 months, if they come in 2 months into, and so you've contracted with them for 10 months, they're only going to get 10 months worth of that 12-month living allowance. Unless what you're contracting with them to do for those 10 months is significantly different from what the people doing 12 months are, and then it would be a different position. You could contract with them for 10 months and pay them, if it's a 10-month, do you see what I'm saying? But if it's this exact same thing as everybody else is doing, they're just coming in 2 months late, you can only give them 10 months worth of that living allowance. Yes?
Our payroll system requires us to attach an hourly rate to anybody on our payroll. but the actual amount never changes regardless of how many they serve. Is that allowable? It says it can't be paid hourly.
So if they only serve 10 hours in an 80-hour pay period, it's still going to give them the same amount. Then that should be fine. As long as it's not decreasing based on the hours they're working or increasing. Does that make sense?
I just want to confirm, so you're saying if they come in, like you said, the shortest amount of time is 9 months,
Mm-hmm.
and they're in the exact same position, somebody come in at 12 months, we can only pay them for the 9-month period?
Correct. That's the policy of the corporation. The only difference, and I'm making this very distinct, if that position is different from what those 12 months are, and there's a reason why it's at a 9-month position and it's got some real differences from the others, then that's a different position and you can determine what you're paying that person. No, if it's to fill a position that someone left, then technically you should be giving them the full 12 months. They don't have to serve only 9 months. That's your call. It would. You need to talk to your commission. As a commission at my level, I allow a program to extend a contract for a few months for a member to complete their term of service if necessary.
And we also have some sub-grantees in Idaho who have a 12-month program and a 9-month program. So it's stated in their grant. So the 9 months, because they're coming into a 9-month program, they do receive the full living allowance in that 9 months because it's a 9-month term of service. So they have two separate, a 12-month and a 9-month, but it's written in their program. So
And
for that situation, they would.
yeah, so if you have, and so it's two different positions. They have 12-month positions and they have 9-month positions. But if it was a 12-month position that they were coming into, 3 months into it, you can do one of two things. If they want to only work the 9 months, then they only get 9 months worth of a living allowance. If you as an organization and the commission allows you to give that member the full 12 months, you can do that also. Okay, really quick, we're going to be done. Personal and compelling circumstances, releasing a member for cause. You guys are all aware it's now up to at the organization level. It used to have to go all the way up to the corporation to get approval to release a member for cause. It's now at the organization's discretion. There are some clear criteria in the provision or in the regulations that describe what the corporation believes is personal and compelling. As an organization, you can make that decision, and then you are required to keep documentation related to that compelling personal circumstance and the release with a partial education award. So if a member leaves early, there's only two ways to have them leave. The first one is personal and compelling circumstance. The second one is for cause. Now, we all cringe when we hear for cause because it sounds like they didn't perform, right? That's not necessarily true. The corporation just sees any other reason as cause. When you exit a member for anything else and they don't get an education award, they may have fulfilled their term of service and done it magnificently, right? They're moving or something's happening and for some reason they have to leave. You are allowed in e-grants to go ahead and certify that they're eligible for another term of service. And just because they left early doesn't eliminate them from being eligible for another term of service. So I just want to make that clear. It is considered cause, but they could be eligible to serve another term. Yes?
One thing that I found that's difficult is if we have people that leave early for a situation they believe is prorated, but the documentation doesn't come on time. And so you have to exit them out because we're bound by that 30-day requirement in the e-grants, but they have a year to grieve the process. They come back a couple months later with the documentation. It can reverse the decision, but once you put it in the e-grants, it changes your 30 days at a later date, so you almost get penalized.
So you as a program have a policy that they have to provide documentation before you'll give them personal compelling? Because that's your own internal policy. If you have somebody who has come to you and explained a situation that you believe is personal and compelling, you can exit them with personal compelling and then allow them to provide you that documentation. But if you as an organization have a policy that you have to have that documentation before you'll do anything, then yeah, you could run into that issue. It does, but correct, but it doesn't. Yeah, there are some situations where it shouldn't be that that it shouldn't take that long to get that documentation. There are some situations where all the documentation might be is a letter from the individual saying, my husband was transferred, da-da-da-da-da. Does that make sense? So it varies by, and I understand where there would be issues. I'm just saying as an organization, that's a decision that you've made at that level. Yeah, and so you've exited them. It is a hassle to reverse it. Did I see another hand? Okay, last slide. Member exits. Members must be exited within 30 days of the end of their term of service. Same thing with enrollment, exit and enrollment. And sometimes I think we're even a little more slack with the exit than we are with the enrollment. It's important because the longer it takes you to exit, the longer it takes the member to access that education award. And there may be members that need to access right away. The last thing to remember is in order for a member to receive an education award, you or someone within your organization is certifying that that member is eligible. And this came directly from provisions, says to receive the education benefit, you do the certified. The grantee and individual or entity acting on behalf of the grantee is responsible for the accuracy of the information certified on the end of term certification. So when you say yes, what they're saying is if in an audit, for some reason, they find that they didn't actually fulfill all the requirements, the organization is going to be responsible potentially to repay part of that education award. Okay? Questions? Yes.
The thing you were talking about, leaving early for cause, they can still earn an ed award, they can still serve again, sorry.
Yes.
So when you're hiring somebody, if they served before, you have to get evidence that they successfully completed their prior term of service, right?
Not necessarily. I believe that e-grants that can tag the social security number. Does that make sense? So if Carrie has had a member serve and exited that member and said, no, they're not eligible to serve again, and you go to try to enroll that member again, I believe, Doug, you can tell me if I'm wrong, e-grants knows that you have said, because of the social security number, that person's not eligible to serve again. So if you put the person in and everything goes through fine, then that tells you that they were, if they've served before, they were exited with the ability to serve again. If they don't have the ability to serve again, e-grants won't let you continue enrollment.
My understanding is that it's the program's call that the member has to reveal that they were released for cause.
Well, but Doug, am I wrong? Does e-grants catch that? Okay. It does. It catches it if a program has said they're not eligible to serve again. E-grants will catch it when you put their social security number in to enroll them.
So the former program officer decides he may release somebody for cause because they're moving or something like that, but then he can check the box that says yes, they are still eligible.
Correct.
So that's the equivalent to when they're reapplying. It says successfully completed.
Yes.
Prior term of service.
Correct. Correct. Yes, success because it's successfully completed. If he selects that they're not eligible, then
So successfully completed does not mean
they served all their hours.
all of the requirements.
Correct.
I don't think you can bar someone from applying to another AmeriCorps program. Like, I don't think an AmeriCorps program has the power to do that. I mean, you have to reveal that you would.
No, it does. You are certifying when you exit a member if you feel like they successfully completed and would be eligible for another term.
Right, and so you can actually, like, basically by checking that box or not, you're basically saying you can never do an AmeriCorps.
Correct. You are. You are. Yes.
And aren't you then also obligated to get a copy of the final evaluation within the file?
If they've served it all or if they were exited.
If they served with another program?
No. There is no requirement for you to get information from the previous program. Okay, I've ran over time. So any other questions? Hopefully we'll be able to do at the end. We're going to let Renee go. Please welcome Renee. Thank you.
So just so that you guys can make it to lunch on time and we make sure that we get those post-tests done, I'm just going to kind of go through these slides and go through what's probably the most important that I think you guys need to know. And so she talked a lot about the member files and member timesheets. So when you're doing your record keeping, you need to make sure that you maintain all of those records in order to say that this member has served. So make sure that you maintain all of those records. And you also need to make sure that in those files, it proves that they're eligible to participate and that they successfully completed all the requirements. That just might be on the post-test, I'm not sure. A program also needs to store, they can store the member files electronically, and if they choose to store those electronically, and remember that what this is talking about is scanned documents. So you guys will have access to this handout, so I won't go through these. I think the most important thing I do want to say is that when you scan those documents, make sure that you have an image of an original signature if there was one required. Because if you don't have that, that will also be considered incomplete, and so they won't take that as a complete file. Criminal history checks, you need to make sure that the records are maintained in the members' files unless you've received approval from the corporation to do something differently. You also need to have proof that you've reviewed those background checks when you were making the decision as to whether the member is eligible to serve. And you can also, Kinza went into a lot of detail on the background checks, so you can find additional information on the Knowledge Network. Required reporting. So on the required reporting, in order to know the timing and frequency of the reporting, you can find that in the terms and conditions or the provisions. For those of you who are subgrantees to a state commission, you want to check with them because their reporting may be different than what's actually in those provisions. So the FFR is the Financial Federal Report, and it's a consolidated federal cash and federal expenditure report. And currently, grantees must submit the grantees, meaning the commissions, will submit the FFRs in e-grants to the Corporation for National and Community Service. And then it also goes to HHS, which is Health and Human Services. It's a cash management data to the HHS, will go quarterly, and then the award obligation data will go to CNCS on a semi-annual basis. So I actually have my subgrantees do an FFR quarterly, but I have to submit it semi-annually to the corporation. Progress reports, also we have to submit those from the commission standpoint to the corporation semi-annually, but I do have what I do is the high-risk programs, they come in and do a quarterly progress report for us, and the programs that we see as lower risk, we have them do them on a semi-annual basis. So all commissions are different. Make sure that you know what your commission requires. And then the A133 audits, make sure that the commissions receive a copy, and subgrantees must submit those to their commissions. The other thing that you want to do is for the commission is have something like a memo in there stating that you've read it, and if there's any findings, what those findings are. And you also want to have the date you received it, the date you reviewed it, and then you also want to put in there and look at the federal dollars that they've received through the AmeriCorps grant and the money that you've expended to them, and make sure that those are fairly close. Because Idaho was audited, and that was one of the audit findings, was that we didn't check what they had in their A133 as the funds they had received from us as to the funds that we had expended to them. So the closeout information, the final FFR, that will come from the subgrantees will give us a final FFR, and the commissions will put the final FFR in e-grants, and it also needs to go into the payment management system. So I think what's important here is that a final closeout grant for a subgrantee is not the same as for the commission. So the commission closes their grants on a 3-year grant cycle, and that's when the grant is actually closed out. So you'll need to check, even though you may be at the end of your 3-year grant cycle and you're a subgrantee, the commission itself probably isn't at the end of theirs. So the actual closeout of the grant, the commission will have to tell you when the formula grant or the competitive grant or school turnaround grant has been actually closed. And make sure if you need additional information, you can go to this. Oh, 0 minutes. Okay, 0 minutes left. So retaining your records, be sure and retain them for 3 years after the final FFR. Do know that CNCS can subsequently do an audit on your program 3 years after you've actually closed that grant. So make sure that you maintain all of those records, and the requirements are included in the CNCS regulations. Fixed grant, this is my last slide. So fixed grant awards, remember that the records retention for member files, those do apply, but an FFR is not required. So they won't have that requirement, and it's because they do not have a federally approved budget, and they also have to don't abide by the federal cost principles. So with that, I'll conclude my section of it. And does anybody have any questions that we can answer while we're handing out the post-test?
They're out.
Oh, they're out. Does anybody have any questions?
Not about the post-test.
Yeah, don't ask. Yes.
Sorry, I just have a comment to Doug mostly. This has been really great and very helpful. I know we had a situation where we messed up. I'm a sub-grantee program director for 2 programs. We messed up and the members' service hours were disallowed. And I know why you have to do that, but just to give you guys some feedback, it's the worst conversation in the world to have with your members, saying that you screwed up and now you're being penalized for that. And so just some feedback, if there's any way, I'd rather pay $1,000 fine or go and, go to Congress or whatever than to have those members' hours disallowed.
Right. And if everyone's heard that, that's the anguish you have to go through to tell a member their hours are denied, and because of the corporation's strict enforcement of eligible hours and so forth. I'm not a program expert. I spend 90% of my time in other areas, but when I have had conversations relating to that concern, my boss has told me that you may not want to hear it, but one of the reactions is an organization there's nothing prohibiting you as an organization from making that individual whole. And what that means is you footing the amount of award that they would have earned had the mistake not have been made.
Some commissions require that.
No, and that's
So that if there's a disallowed cost, the member is held harmless. So that means that the corporation may discount how much is going into the trust, but the organization, like Doug said, as a commission, will require the organization to come up with that difference, because it shouldn't be penalizing the member. They were doing what they thought they were supposed to be doing based on what the organization told them. So unless the member was doing something that they just knew wasn't right, as a commission, we look at them as being held harmless in that situation.
A quick answer to the question that was answered asked in the beginning of the session about resident alien certifications that expire during service. The answer is that you have to have at all times a valid certification. So if they're in an administrative process that's going to take 90 days, you need to put them in suspension until they get that green card back, and then you can put them back into service. So that's...
It's 90 days prior to before it expires, so they have to register.
Right, but if it's in the mail and it hasn't gotten there for 3 or 5 days, you've got a gap, you've got to suspend them for the gap and then re-enroll, start them up again. Yeah, yes, Debbie.
I just wanted to say, related to records retention, that's another one of those issues that I would check with your state commission. In Washington State, we're required to keep records for 6 years.
Oh, yeah, because it can be based on your state.
Yeah.
Right. And if you don't mind me talking over you as you wrap up the test, we were discussing yesterday about when SSA rejects someone, right today, you send all these Social Security numbers in and they clear, hopefully almost everyone, but occasionally they will reject someone and you have to keep that documentation. The question came up of, if you're an overseer, you're a prime grantee, you're a commission, you're a national director, and you have to make sure that those records are being gathered, how would you know when you go to a site that these people, out of 100, 5 got rejected and you should have that documentation on file? The answer from the people who use the trust tell me that there is a designation in the trust by that person's name cleared by SSA. So if someone's doing oversight work on your program and they look down your 100 members and they see 3 people without the cleared by SSA flag, they're going to be looking to see that you gathered and kept the documentation of citizenship for those 3 people. That's what I'm told. I don't personally do it, but I'm passing along.
Okay, you have about 2 minutes to finish the post-test. And if you have them ready, just leave them in the middle of your table and we'll collect them. Thanks, everybody. Let's give everybody a round of applause for everything they did.